All right, let's jump right in.
Sounds good to me.
We're diving deep into the history of punishment today.
Oh, yeah. Buckle up, because it's a wild ride.
From like public torture to reformers to the rise of prisons, it's pretty intense stuff.
It's a fascinating evolution for sure.
I mean, some of this stuff from Foucault's Discipline and Punish is blowing my mind.
Foucault really gets into the nitty-gritty.
So, okay, one thing that really struck me was this idea that crime was actually decreasing in the 1700s.
Especially violent crime.
Right. But punishments, they didn't decrease, they became more widespread and systematic.
Yeah, why would they create stricter systems when things seem to be getting better, right?
Exactly. It seems counterintuitive.
Well, the paradox that Foucault highlights,
Okay.
and it points to a bigger shift in how power was working back then.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So think about the context. It was a time of huge economic and social change.
Right, the 1700s, a lot going on.
The middle class was rising,
Yeah.
and with that came a whole new emphasis on private property.
So suddenly everyone's worried about someone stealing their stuff.
That was definitely a factor, yeah.
But how does that lead to harsher punishments for everyone?
Well, it wasn't just individual anxieties, although those were definitely there.
Okay.
There's this growing idea that managing and controlling populations is key to a stable society.
Interesting.
Punishment becomes less about the king's vengeance and more about keeping the economic system running smoothly.
Okay, that makes sense.
This is where Foucault's concept of the economy of illegalities comes in.
Economy of what now? I gotta admit, you lost me there.
It's a bit of a head scratcher, I know.
Yeah.
Basically, it means that different social classes had different tolerated illegal activities.
Oh, so like what might be a serious crime for a merchant could be overlooked for a peasant.
Exactly. What the elite could get away with, the poor couldn't.
Interesting.
But as the middle class rose, they wanted to control those tolerated illegalities of the lower classes.
Because they saw them as a threat to their newfound wealth and stability?
Precisely. The rules of the game were changing.
Okay, so reformers wanted to create a system that was more reliable, consistent.
Exactly. The king's absolute power, what Foucault calls superpower, actually led to a lot of inconsistency in punishment.
Really?
Oh yeah, think about it.
Okay.
You've got overlapping courts, pardons being bought, a ton of variation based on your social status.
So it was kind of all over the place?
Yeah, it was a mess. Reformers wanted something more predictable and standardized.
Okay, so not necessarily harsher, but definitely more uniformly applied.
Exactly. They were trying to level the playing field, so to speak.
Makes you wonder if that desire for reliability and control is still shaping our legal system today.
Absolutely. It's a question worth pondering.
For sure. Okay, but let's talk about those public executions for a minute.
Oh, yeah. Those were intense.
Foucault's descriptions are vivid.
They were designed to be scary.
I get that, but he also says reformers were really disgusted by them.
More than just squeamish.
Yeah. So what was that about?
Well, they saw public executions as messy and ultimately ineffective.
Ineffective. But weren't they supposed to deter crime?
In theory, yeah.
Okay.
But did they actually work? Not really. Plus, they often turned into these chaotic spectacles.
Like with the crowd getting riled up?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes even sympathizing with the condemned or even rioting.
So it kind of backfired then?
In a way, yeah. It wasn't the controlled demonstration of power they intended.
Wow, so the whole meaning of punishment was starting to shift.
That's a key point, yeah.
So if public spectacle wasn't the answer, what did reformers see as the ideal punishment?
They had a very calculated approach to it.
Even in their humaneness, right?
Exactly. It wasn't just about less pain, but a whole strategy for shaping behavior.
Fascinating. Okay, so tell me about the strategy. What did they come up with?
They developed these fascinating rules for how punishment should work.
Rules, like a whole rule book for punishment.
Well, not literally, but yeah, they had very specific ideas about how it should be done.
Okay, I'm all ears, spill the tea.
One rule was minimum quantity.
Minimum quantity, what does that even mean?
It means just enough pain to outweigh the benefits of the crime.
So like a cost-benefit analysis for criminals?
Exactly. If the punishment is too harsh, it might backfire and make people more rebellious.
Okay, that makes sense. I can see that.
Another important rule was sufficient ideality.
Okay, now that one definitely needs some explaining.
It means the idea of the punishment matters more than the actual suffering.
Interesting.
They wanted to deter potential criminals, not just the one being punished.
I see. So it's not just about punishing the individual, but sending a message to everyone else.
Exactly. This is what Foucault calls lateral effects. Punishment becomes a performance, a way to influence everyone's behavior.
Kind of like making an example out of someone.
Yes, but in a much more calculated and strategic way.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
Foucault uses some great examples to illustrate this, like Vermeyle's idea of forcing poisoners to drink poison publicly.
Oh, wow. Talk about poetic justice.
It's all about creating a vivid spectacle that will deter others from committing the same crime.
I see. So it's still about spectacle, but in a different way.
Right. It's not about the king's power anymore, but about using spectacle to shape behavior.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got minimum quantity, sufficient ideality, lateral effects.
Yeah, those are some of the key principles.
And it really makes you think about how even humane reforms can still be about control.
That's a crucial insight.
Okay, but here's where things get really interesting for me.
Okay, I'm listening.
Foucault says reformers hated prisons.
Yeah, they saw them as despotic and ineffective.
Right. So how in the world did prisons become the dominant form of punishment? It seems totally backwards.
It's a head-scratcher for sure.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense on the surface.
Prisons were initially meant for minor crimes or as holding places before trial.
Okay.
But there were these 3 early models that started to change things, even if they weren't perfect.
Okay, which models are we talking about?
We're talking about Amsterdam, Ghent, and Philadelphia.
Okay, so these 3 kind of paved the way for the modern prison system.
In a way, yeah, they were the pioneers, even if they didn't always get it right.
So what was so special about these models? Did they actually manage to avoid the problems reformers saw with prisons?
Well, they tried to, but it wasn't easy. Amsterdam's Erasmus was all about transforming criminals through hard work.
Oh, okay, so like a tough love boot camp kind of thing.
Yeah, kinda. They had this idea that idleness bred crime.
Oh, okay, I can see the logic there. Keep them busy, keep them out of trouble.
Exactly. So they figured instilling a strong work ethic would rehabilitate them, turn them into productive members of society.
Makes sense in theory, but I'm already seeing some potential problems.
Oh yeah, there were plenty.
Like what happens when you force people to work in cramped, unsanitary conditions? Doesn't exactly sound like a recipe for moral transformation.
You're telling me it often led to resentment, resistance, even more bad behavior.
So it kind of backfired then.
Yeah, and on top of that, these institutions were expensive to run.
And I'm guessing the promised economic benefits didn't always pan out.
You got it. So there was this constant pressure to cut costs, which probably led to even worse conditions.
Like a vicious cycle.
Exactly, a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so Amsterdam's Rasfuus, not exactly a shining success. What about Ghent? What was their approach?
Ghent's Maison de Force took that work aspect even further.
Okay, how so?
They actually tied it directly to the economy.
Interesting, tell me more.
They envisioned prisoners as this potential workforce that could contribute to the economy.
So they were trying to make prisons profitable.
Yeah, kind of like turning criminals into profit centers.
Wow, that's a bold idea. But didn't they run into problems with competition from free labor?
Oh, absolutely. That was a constant source of tension.
I can imagine guilds and other workers wouldn't be too thrilled about having to compete with convict labor.
You're right about that. It created a lot of friction.
Plus, isn't there an ethical issue with profiting from the labor of people who are being punished?
You hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
It gets very complicated very quickly.
Okay, so we've got Amsterdam focused on discipline, Ghent on economics. What about Philadelphia? They were the ones who were all about isolation and spiritual reform, right?
That's right. They went in a completely different direction.
Did they have more success with that approach?
Unfortunately, no.
Really? Why not?
Well, they avoided some of the pitfalls of forced labor,
Okay.
but their emphasis on solitary confinement created a whole new set of challenges.
Oh, yeah. I've read about that solitary confinement can have some pretty devastating psychological effects.
You're telling me it can lead to depression, anxiety, even hallucinations.
Seems counterproductive to try and reform someone by basically torturing them psychologically.
Yeah, it's hard to see how that kind of treatment could lead to genuine change.
Plus, didn't the reformers hate the secrecy surrounding solitary confinement?
Oh yeah, they were all about transparency and accountability, remember?
Right. But with solitary confinement, it's almost impossible to monitor what's happening inside the prison.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it became this breeding ground for abuse and neglect.
Which is exactly what they were trying to avoid in the first place.
The irony is not lost on me. It's a classic case of the road to hell being paved with good intentions.
So it sounds like those early prisons, despite their best intentions, often ended up replicating the same problems they were meant to solve.
That's the tragic truth of it, yeah.
And it raises those deeper questions about the nature of power and the limits of reform.
Absolutely. Even when we're motivated by good intentions, The drive to control and punish can have unintended consequences.
Makes you wonder if we've really come that far from the public executions of the past.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it?
You know, it's striking how even back then they were already grappling with the ethical implications of profiting from prisoner labor.
Yeah, that debate is still very much alive today.
Absolutely. But let's get back to Foucault for a minute. He talks about these two competing visions of punishment, the punitive city and the coercive institution. What's the difference between those two?
Okay, so think of the punitive city as this open-air theater of punishment,
Okay, I'm picturing it.
where signs and spectacles are used to create these clear links between crime and punishment in people's minds.
So it's all about making an example out of criminals.
Yes, but it's also about educating the public, reinforcing moral values.
Like a big public morality play designed to scare people straight.
Exactly. A constant reminder of the consequences of breaking the law.
Okay, I get it. But prisons operate on a different level, right?
Right. Instead of trying to persuade people to be good through public displays, they focus on controlling bodies and behavior.
Through routines, timetables, physical constraints, that kind of thing.
Precisely. Think of those work regimens we talked about, walking in a wheel to move a machine, beating hemp, polishing marble.
It's like they're trying to break the prisoner down and rebuild them into a more obedient person.
That's the essence of the coercive institution.
But not necessarily a better person.
Right. It's not about transforming the soul through spiritual reflection or public shaming. It's about shaping behavior through repetition, discipline, control.
And it's that efficiency, that ability to manage and control populations on a large scale that helps explain the rise of prisons.
Exactly. It was a system that could be scaled up and applied to a whole range of offenses.
So it's a more subtle form of control, but also more invasive.
Right. Precisely because it's happening behind closed doors, it's easier to ignore or forget about.
And while the reformers initially favored the punitive city with its transparency and public morality,
The practical realities of crime control pushed them towards the coercive institution.
it wasn't necessarily a conscious choice, but a gradual shift driven by anxieties about social order, property, and the need for a reliable system of punishment.
Exactly. It was a pragmatic response to a complex set of challenges.
It makes you wonder if we've really come that far from the public executions of the past.
We may not be putting people's heads on spikes anymore.
But are we really any closer to achieving a truly just and humane system of punishment?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
And Foucault's analysis gives us some powerful tools to think about that question.
He challenges us to question our assumptions, to look beyond the surface, to see the deeper forces at play.
Absolutely. But before we get too deep into that, I think it's important to take a closer look at how these early prison models actually played out in practice.
Yeah, let's dive into that.
Did they live up to the reformers' hopes?
Or did they fall prey to the very abuses they feared?
There's definitely a lot to unpack there. Okay, so we've talked about these early prison models, Amsterdam, Ghent, Philadelphia, trying to reform criminals, but did they actually work?
Yeah, did they live up to the reformers' hopes?
Or did they just become, like Foucault said, coercive institutions focused on control, not rehabilitation?
That's the big question, isn't it? And the answer, well, it's complicated.
Figures. Let's start with Amsterdam's Rasvuis. They were all about hard work and discipline.
Right, transforming criminals through sheer willpower.
But I can already see how that could go wrong.
Oh, yeah, you're right to be skeptical, forcing people to work in cramped conditions.
Often unsanitary too, right?
Exactly. It's not exactly a recipe for moral transformation.
Not really. It seems like it would breed more resentment and resistance.
You get it often led to more bad behavior, not less.
And these institutions were expensive to run too, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, big time. And the economic benefits they promised didn't always materialize.
So I'm guessing there was this constant pressure to cut costs.
You know, and that probably just made the conditions even worse.
Ugh, a vicious cycle.
A recipe for disaster, you could say.
Okay, so Amsterdam's Rasvuis, not exactly a success story. What about Ghent?
Ghent's Maison de Force, they doubled down on the work aspect.
Okay, remind me how they did that.
They tied it directly to the economy.
Right. They wanted to use prisoners as a workforce, make prisons profitable.
That was the idea anyway.
Ambitious. But didn't they face a ton of opposition from free laborers?
Oh, yeah. Huge pushback.
People saw it as unfair competition.
Rightfully so. It undercut wages and created all sorts of economic tension.
Plus, it's ethically questionable to profit off the labor of people who are being punished, isn't it?
That's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah.
It gets messy fast.
So Ghent's experiment with prison labor also ran into problems.
Yeah, it wasn't the solution they hoped for.
Okay, so Amsterdam and Ghent both struggled. What about Philadelphia? They were all about solitary confinement and spiritual reflection.
Yeah, they tried a different approach.
Maybe they had more success.
Well, they did avoid some of the issues with forced labor,
Okay.
but solitary confinement created its own set of problems.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier. It can be really damaging psychologically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Depression, anxiety, hallucinations, even self-harm.
It's hard to see how that could lead to any kind of meaningful reform.
You're trying to rehabilitate someone, but you're basically torturing them mentally.
It doesn't really add up. And remember, the reformers were all about transparency and accountability.
Right. They wanted to make sure the system was fair and just.
But solitary confinement is shrouded in secrecy.
It's like a black box. You can't see what's happening inside.
So it creates this perfect environment for abuse and neglect.
Exactly. The very things they were trying to prevent.
It's almost like all three models failed to live up to the reformers' ideals.
It's a sobering thought.
They either became brutally oppressive or economically unsustainable or psychologically damaging.
Yeah. It paints a pretty bleak picture.
It makes you realize that good intentions aren't always enough.
The reformers were trying to create a better system,
A more humane system.
but they were stuck in a particular historical context.
One that was all about social order and economic change and the need for control.
Exactly. And those forces shaped their thinking in ways they probably didn't even realize.
So even as they were trying to move away from the brutality of the past,
They ended up creating a system that was, in many ways, just as controlling.
and maybe even more dehumanizing,
It's a tragic irony.
it makes you question whether we've really made any progress at all.
Have we really come that far from the public executions of the past?
Are we any closer to a truly just and humane system of punishment?
Those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves.
Yeah, what does it mean to punish someone fairly and effectively?
How do we balance the need for public safety with the need to treat people humanely?
How do we break these cycles of crime and violence?
Foucault doesn't give us easy answers.
But he gives us the tools to ask the right questions,
He challenges us to think critically about the systems we create,
to question our assumptions.
to imagine new possibilities.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this.
The history of punishment isn't just some academic subject.
It's a reflection of who we are as a society.
It's about how we choose to deal with those who break our laws, who challenge our values.
And it's a story that's still being written.
We all have a role to play in shaping the next chapter.
That's a powerful thought.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from public executions to solitary confinement, from the punitive city to the coercive institution.
It's been quite a journey,
But most importantly, we've started a conversation
and we hope you'll continue to explore these ideas.
to think critically about the world around you.
To question, to challenge, to imagine.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.